So my name is Greg Staios. I'm the manager of the Research Quality and Privacy section at the Applied Health Research Center at St. Michael's Hospital. Just to kind of give you some context, I've been in quality pretty much most of my career. I did a little bit of an offshoot in the research ethics area, and so obviously this talk kind of stemmed from my year and a bit where I was a manager of a research ethics office at the Center for Addiction Mental Health, where when this presentation was being requested, I thought, oh, this is a great idea. How do I meld together my new role in research ethics together with my old role and you know, my passion in kind of incorporating quality principles into research practice? And I thought, well, the REB or the IRB is a great method of being able to do that. So this is kind of where this talk came from. All right, so first things first, let's kind of summarize what QBD and kind of quality management systems look like. So QBD is kind of kind of what we're talking about, but that's, more fulsome is the quality risk management. We really started seeing that in around November 2005. So with the ICHQ9, quality risk management was a document that came out. It mostly seemed to be used by people in the GMP sector, not really permeating all that well over into our... I'm just going to move over to the main mic if that's okay. Sorry. If there's any feedback, I apologize. Okay. So really what we end up finding is that, it was used in the GMP sector, but it wasn't really making its way very effectively into kind of clinical research practices. And really we were still relying a lot on being reactive, right? A lot of firefighting approaches, a lot of focus on corrective action rather than focusing on preventive action and figuring out how we might be able to deal with that stuff. Some of the industry partners and people who were involved in kind of quality management systems and were really pushing the boundaries about interpreting the regulations and GCP in a novel fashion. And that really prompted a lot of regulators to start moving towards really pushing for increases in kind of looking at quality management approaches in different areas. The first being looking at monitoring. So we saw the FDA put out a guidance for industry over a set of clinical investigations, a risk-based approach to monitoring in August 2013. With a couple years before that where they put out a draft document that highlights some of the key parameters. That was followed up again with Transcelerate with their risk-based approaches to monitoring and their entire group of information that they have around risk-based monitoring. And ultimately, more recently, with ICHE 6R2, with the changes in GCP that added to that little placeholder of Section 5, where they added a bunch of stuff around quality risk management, and that came out in November 2016, and it's slowly being adopted by various different regions currently. So when we start looking at, let's just do a quick summary of what we find in ICHR2, GCP, and then we'll jump into a little bit more detail when we start looking at Q9, etc. So essentially what this section is saying is that we need to have a plan to manage quality throughout all stages of the study, right? So it's obviously important that we not only focus right at the beginning, which is, I think most of us put a significant amount of effort in startup, but really looking at it from the entire span that the study kind of lives, beginning, end, closeout, all that kind of stuff. So one of our focuses really needs to be on participant safety and data integrity and reliability of trial results, which is something that we'll loop back to numerous times, particularly when we talk about risk assessment. A key consideration that we have to be very acutely aware of is the fact that those domains that lead to things that could potentially cause risk to participants or might have us not achieve our trial outcomes is an important consideration that we need to always be acutely aware of. So that being said, what they're mandating is that there needs to be efficient clinical trial protocols and tools and procedures for data collection and procedures. I'm sure all of you have kind of come across scenarios where you find a protocol where the body of the protocol is different than what might be in the schedule of assessments, which might not necessarily match what's in the CRFs, and we end up having this disconnect. So there's a real focus on making sure that that's being properly done and that they're efficient, right? So that we're not having a lot of turbulent language that kind of gives somewhat contradictory messages, and that we are keeping things as simple as possible so that people can appropriately execute a protocol without too many additional hurdles and obstacles. The methods that we use for assessing risk, and something that they really mention, needs to be proportionate to the risk inherent to the trial and the importance of the information that we collected. So if we have a tertiary or quaternary outcome measure that's really not important and that we're not appropriately powered to answer, we're probably not going to want to spend as much time focusing on those types of measures, right? Whether it be SDV or otherwise, to make sure that they're, incredibly accurate, other than the ones, let's say, like our primary outcome measures, which we're going to focus a lot of time on. Again, that being said, protocols, case report forms, other documents need to be clear, concise, and consistent, right? So an important consideration. When you look at anything around kind of quality management in the pharmaceutical industry, this kind of diagram is going to pop up quite a bit. You're probably going to see it in any article you read or anything like that. So this comes from Q9, and it specifically kind of outlines in a very high-level fashion what a quality risk management system needs to incorporate. So when we look at it, kind of the three big domains are risk assessment, risk control, and risk review. When we look at risk assessment, kind of self-explanatory, assess the risk, figure out what that risk might be. Risk control, what are the steps that we're going to take to either put some systems and procedures in place to manage that risk, or do we see the risk and say, you know what, this doesn't really pose a significant issue, and therefore we accept the risk. And then another critical important is obviously risk review. So not necessarily just letting things off and not coming back to it and reviewing it, making sure that it continues to stay accurate or making updates to that plan as needed. So if you look at all of those sections, there's always loops moving backwards, right, to kind of help us and make sure and give us little reminders to say that we have to move backwards and take a look and see if our processes continue to remain relevant and whether any changes might be required. We're going to spend a little bit of time kind of just talking about this diagram here. So when we look at risk assessment, generally when we're assessing risks, what we need to look at is identifying the hazards, right? So hazards are just kind of items that come up, and the risks are the item that's associated with that hazard, right? So what we have here is figuring out those hazards and evaluating the risks that are present there. There's generally three fundamental questions that we have to ask ourselves when we're kind of coming up with this. The three fundamental questions are we have to ask ourselves what might go wrong, right? So knowing what that might be, figuring out what the likelihood or probability is that it will go wrong, and then what are the consequences and severity. And I'm just going to take a step away, and hopefully you guys can hear me. I just want to kind of go over a chart here, if that's okay. I don't know if you got me there or no. Yeah? Okay. So I just want to kind of spend a little bit of time. Hopefully you guys can hear me as this kind of goes up. But when we look at this, is we want to kind of figure out and kind of the whole summary of risk assessment really ends up being around this risk rating here. So you have severity on one axis and likelihood on the other, right? And when you look at severity, it kind of goes through various different levels, right? You have severity going from over here, but it being negligible, to up here to being a catastrophic failure, right? So that's the severity of any risk that we have. Similarly, when we look at likelihood, we say something is very improbable of it not happening and highly probable of it happening. And when we look at risk, this diagram is going to be pertinent regardless of what kind of risk you assess. If you're looking at financial risk, this is a kind of document that's going to come up for this diagram. If you're looking at, let's say, emergency management and managing disasters, that's something that's going to pop up. It's the same thing that we use when we're looking at things from a clinical research perspective. And so as you can see, as we start going around here, these green sections here, these are generally items that are of low severity and are of low likelihood of happening, right? These ones here, we don't really have to do anything about them. They seem to be okay, they're fairly managed, not something we need to spend a lot of time on making sure that they get managed well. These guys here that we start getting into this section here, so these are the items, let's say, catastrophic or significant severity issues, but they're really improbable. So they don't happen very often. So the question there is we have to monitor them and try and figure out if we can potentially get some sort of a signal that might pop up that suggests that we have an issue that we're going to want to look at, right? So we're going to have some sort of monitoring in place to make sure that these sections here, which are at a little bit higher risk, are appropriately managed. And then we've got these yellow guys here, which we need to start taking some action about, right? We know that this is an issue. The severity and the likelihood of this is enough that we need to figure out a method for being able to address that. And then finally, when we have a section in the red, is these are significant issues and we need to stop what we're doing. Our systems and procedures are not effective at being able to manage them. So whatever could potentially be leading to those risks needs to come to a halt until we figure out a method of being able to address those issues moving forward. So that's kind of just a quick overview of, risk management in a nutshell. So when we look at risk identification, right, and we're kind of as a component of our risk assessment process, something we need to be looking at is we need to figure out a systematic way of using information to identify the hazards that we have. So we can identify this generally through a lot of different methods that we have, right? We can have historical data. So if we have an audit function, if we don't, we can start one and start collecting data and figuring out what our risks might be, right? So if we have an audit function, taking a look at those metrics and seeing what we have and seeing, if you need me to go back to are we still good? Yeah? All right, I'll go back to here then. So in this one here, what we can find is if we have an audit program, an important point obviously might be that we have this historic data that we can look at. The next two are kind of linked. We can have kind of a theoretical analysis of what might exist. So people who work in the field may have an idea of, say, well, this type of study, we may have this kind of risk that pops up. So it's something we need to be aware of, which links in nicely with the next point below, which is that expert opinion or informed opinion. So we have people who've been working in the field who may have subject matter expertise in the specific areas that we're looking at, and that's an area we're going to spend some time really gathering their input and figuring out, well, where might these risks potentially come up, and how can we appropriately kind of identify them even ahead of the curve, even if we don't necessarily have any historical data or information there. Another key component that I sometimes gets lost is the concerns of the stakeholders. So our stakeholders have concerns around the risks that matter to them. And I think it's important, I'm guilty of this as well, I'll tell you that, but is not necessarily fully appreciating or realizing what the stakeholders might be. So our end users, whether that be our scientists or whoever that might be, about them not meeting their deliverables and what those risks look like to them, and then helping them achieve those outcomes as well. So that's kind of a thing we'd have to look at. A big question people end up asking is, well, where do this is completely, can't read anything, but I'll tell you where you can find this. So a lot of people say, well, where do I even start when I'm looking at a risk assessment and kind of figuring out where I might be able to identify risks? And quite frankly, it can be quite challenging if you're trying to come up with something from scratch. What we can do is we can leverage something. We're really fortunate that Transcelerate came out with the risk assessment and categorization tool, the RAC tool. So if you go on Google and type in Transcelerate RAC, you're going to find this here. And this is a very long and very daunting document. It's many, many, many pages long. Don't get freaked out when you see it. It's generally used in the kind of industry sector. They use it a lot in drug trials. So Transcelerate is obviously an amalgam of various different drug companies have decided to follow a certain process that they feel fits best for all of them. So this tool here will enumerate a large proportion of risks that exist in a trial, both from what we call a system level and also from a protocol level, right? So if we look at this one here on that first chart, we're going to have safety, right? So those are some safety risks, what the associated risks is, what some of the considerations we have to have are, right? There's going to be some study phase risks that they discuss and kind of think about. They end up having a few different metrics that they use. So we were talking before about severity, and I apologize if I'm getting them in the wrong order, but they call it impact, which is essentially the severity of the issue happening. And when you go on that drop-down menu, it'll give you a variety of different options. You score them a particular way. Similar, they have the likelihood, which here they call probability, right? And that's the same thing. They have an additional metric, which they call detectability, right? Which is, well, if I can't detect the risk, I can't do anything about it. So part of what we talk about is, well, what systems can we put in place to potentially detect risks that we didn't know about, right? And so that's an area that Transcelerate adds, which kind of depending on how well we can detect it, it's a potential that we can consider action on. So what happens is when you enter all these, this is a macro and it's an Excel spreadsheet. You enter all this information here. You can code how much that specific measure is. And then after the completion of all this thing, you end up getting an overall risk rating. And using that overall risk rating, you can figure out if you're robust enough, you can figure out whether there's a standard set of procedures that you might want to follow around particular risk ratings. I found the most beneficial part of something like this, at least coming from the academic sector, is just thinking about what other people see as potential risks, and then thinking about how we might be able to at least conceptualize them, which sometimes ends up being a really difficult in and of itself. So when we start looking at part of our risk assessment, we need to obviously do an analysis. So when we start looking at analysis and evaluation, they kind of look very similar, but regardless, when you look at them, is you're trying to estimate the risks that are associated with each of the hazards that you've identified. So you have a particular hazard, and you want to figure out what that risk is. Generally, that's when you're trying to figure out, well, where does the likelihood and the severity of that kind of meet, and what would that potentially risk be of that issue. The 2 points of consideration that I think is important to think about, specifically when we're looking at analyzing risk, is, and I think we're all guilty of it, but if we work in quality, sometimes we get very averse to risk, right? We look at risk and we see every single item in the same way. And so what ends up happening is we want to address every risk we identify, and we don't necessarily appreciate that the nuances and the differences in risk between one and another. So there's some things that we might want to look at in a different way and allocate more resources to a risk that we find is more significant, rather than trying to address all the risks that we find, because some of them may be below a certain level of action, and we don't want to there's no sense in utilizing limited resources to try to address those kinds of issues. Another thing that we end up finding sometimes is we end up having we prevent ourselves from innovating, right? We become very insular and we start thinking about things in a very particular way. We may overinterpret regulation. We may inappropriately interpret it. We may think that regulators want certain things. I think a good example of this is kind of what we saw with monitoring. The section that we saw historically in R1 didn't allow for too much interpretation around what type of monitoring was appropriate, so a lot of people defaulted to 100% SDV. And now we're starting to realize that people were like, well, no one said that that's what GCP R1 stated. It allowed flexibility, but a lot of people were resistant from moving back from that and innovating. So this is kind of realizing now that we have electronic systems and that we have all these different ways and procedures that we can implement, is being open to thinking about novel ways of addressing risks that we may have not done before. Right, so maybe we have a computer system that we can implement that might be able to increase the efficiency, or that can double check certain things, so we're reducing manual labor of doing a lot of that stuff and checking things on our own, so we can automate certain processes, which can now free up our time to effectively address other issues that require kind of more human intervention and more human thought and involvement. And then finally, with risk evaluation, we ensure that we have accurate and complete data to make that final assessment, and we ultimately rank our risks as low, medium, or high. And generally, this is the output of that likelihood versus severity outcome, where we actually figure out what our risk is. So now that we've figured out what our risks are, we need to put some procedures in place to control those risks, right? So generally, what we're trying to do when we're controlling risks is we want to reduce those risks to acceptable levels, right? Again, the amount of effort we want to be addressing in controlling those risks needs to be proportionate to the amount of risk that's present, right? So if there's something that could likely lead to a potential harm to a participant, or something that may potentially lead to a study not meeting its outcomes, that's something we definitely want to be spending more time on and making sure that we effectively address that. Obviously, there's different processes that we can use in this, and again, some of it's that kind of cost benefit, right? Kind of figuring out what the cost of not dealing with it is, and seeing which ones we really need to be focusing on. And when I say cost, it doesn't mean financial cost, right? Cost might be, again, a cost to a participant, cost of the study overall, right? When we start looking at questions that we want to consider when we go through this process, when we start looking about, well, is this risk above an acceptable level, right? So another hard question is, well, what's an acceptable level, right? So those are questions we have to ask ourselves. What can we do to reduce or eliminate the risk? What, again, are the appropriate balances between the benefits, risks, and resources? And are the new risks that are introduced, right, by potentially addressing certain risks being properly looked at? So sometimes what you end up finding is you've taken action, you've addressed a particular risk, but now all of a sudden a new risk kind of pops up that you didn't even realize was there before, right? And so that's sometimes you have to think about when those things might be able to pop up. Right, so obviously part of that risk control procedure is that we reduce the harms. That's obviously step number one. We take some action to ultimately mitigate or reduce or avoid quality risks when they exceed a specific threshold, right? Now, obviously those are vast, right? So avoiding and mitigating and completely avoiding it are definitely things that are there. And we obviously want steps that we can take to mitigate the severity and probability and likelihood of harm, or other actions that we can take that potentially may allow us to detect these issues, right? So that's an area we have to be thinking about as well, is can we put procedures in place to detect risks that we didn't necessarily even know existed until we began this risk process. So when we're looking at this overall risk control and risk, reduction approach, again, coming back to this chart, the main activity we're trying to do is drive that change to the bottom left corner. Right, so we want to be taking risks that we find that are in a higher zone and bringing them further closer to that area here. So maybe we bring these guys closer here, maybe we bring those guys closer down, maybe we bring these guys from this sector down into a more acceptable area, right? So that's the ultimate goal of any risk reduction procedure, is to decrease that. That can happen through a variety of different ways and is kind of unique to each study, right? Maybe it's an SOP you need. Maybe it's a training program you have to have in place. Maybe you have to modify your protocol and put in an amendment, right, or a procedure, or you need to better, delineate certain processes, right? So these are all items that need to be considered and thought of on a unique kind of study-by-study basis or on a system-level perspective as well. That being said, there are some times, and this is one that people don't feel very comfortable with, is risk acceptance, right? We've identified a risk, we realize it's there, but we don't necessarily feel that any action is needed for it, right? Because, obviously every risk doesn't require the same amount of effort to be addressed to it, and it might be that at this point, based on our previous actions, that we really don't need to be doing anything to be looking at this any further. And this can take various different forms. It can be a formal process where you've actually enumerated it and talked about why you think that that risk doesn't need to be looked at any further, or it could be an informal process where you just are saying, we've identified it, we're just not going to further review it this cycle perhaps. Maybe we'll come back at the next cycle to look at it and see if this has now become something that we need to be aware of, right? I think it's really important that when we're looking at quality management systems that we are very frank with ourselves and realize that we can't we can't address every risk that we have and can't be fully eliminated. We have to be judicious and pick and figure out what our resources are and then ultimately address those, right? And obviously the amount that we want to be and the processes that we apply to particular risks need to be proportionate to the levels to get those risks to an acceptable level, right? Again, a critical and important component is that you have a regular method to come back, look at your processes, make sure that they work well. So having a risk review is obviously an important component. Most REBs or IRBs will come back at least once a year to look at certain risks, but again, if you don't ask the right questions, you're not necessarily able to collect the right information to be able to effectively look at that. So that's kind of a step away, is kind of looking at your process as well. Does your process effectively capture the data that you need to effectively look at and manage your risks that you have? But regardless, kind of outside of that point, is just making sure that you have a process in place to come back and look at your risks and address them effectively, right? Sometimes when you've gone through this process, maybe it's 1, 2, 3, 10 times, you identify new risks, you come across ones that weren't identified in previous cycles, or perhaps you've had certain latent risks that now all of a sudden were hidden before, but now become of concern, right? And something that you need to be focusing on, right? Again, you want to take that time, take a step back and look at your ongoing quality reviews. So if you have an audit program, taking a look at those, figuring out if there's any domains that map to one another, figuring out how you might be able to look at that information and whether that, let's say, needs, you need to make your training program more robust, or you need other processes that need to be in there to help that out. Similarly, your regulatory inspections, if you've had the I was going to say pleasure, but if you had the pleasure of having a regulatory inspection and having someone who's completely impartial to your organization come in and objectively look at your processes, I think it is a blessing in disguise, because sometimes, one, it can show us what those are, and two, it can really be effective at mobilizing our senior administrators and realizing the importance of that stuff. So that's something I think is important too, and we can really use that to our greatest benefit. Similarly, if you've done any kind of more robust root cause assessments or CAPAs, et cetera, thinking about those and using that information again. Again, we keep coming back to this, the frequency intensity needs to really be determined based on that risk level. So again, from let's say a study perspective, if you're doing this risk assessment, you might say for some studies once a year is fine, for some studies might be every 6 months, every 3 months, right? So these are all things that we need to look at. A point that at least I know I generally kind of sometimes forget is that risk communication part. And it's an important part to keep that in the kind of realizing we need to be engaging our stakeholders throughout all phases, right? And if we look at it, it's a double-headed arrow in each one of those risk communications, right? It's that not only do we disseminate information to our stakeholders, but that the stakeholders also disseminate information back to us, right? Because that's a really important point, so that we are not effectively working in a vacuum, but working in an actual system, in a process that we can help make more robust, right? So that's an item that I think we have to be looking at. And obviously some of these outputs in the areas that we've learned from can be really effective at helping other departments. And I'd say sometimes for those of you who work in departments, you may come across a process, and we were really fortunate in that where we worked was a smaller institution, and a lot of departments would come up with tools or processes that they found to be super effective for them. And what we did is we said, well, we can take that back. They shared that with us, and then that ended up becoming a tool or something that could be helpful to other individuals in the institution. So sometimes some gains that have happened in one pocket can actually be effective across various different areas and can be used by other people. So if you've had some really big wins in your own teams, is thinking about sharing that or figuring out a method of how you can share that's really important as well. The one section I really want to talk about, which is, for me is always important because a lot of times we work in silos. And if we look at this comes from the Transcelerate kind of integrated quality risk management plan, so the IQRMP. When you look at that, it kind of includes a variety of different components. So they, obviously being integrated, you have to include all those different players at the table, right? And figuring out how they're going to be properly looked at. So obviously you're going to assess your risk, you're going to categorize them. Right, you're going to figure out what your critical data thresholds are, right? So what are your critical data variables that you want to be looking at, and what are your thresholds and risk indicators? And so bringing those all together, and then now that you have this big pool of risks, you have to figure out how you parse those risks out to different people to most effectively deal with them, right? So in this one here, as you can see, there's a variety of different areas and different methods that we can use to address those risks that we find. It could be through the protocol. Could be putting certain information in the investigator's brochure. Could be modifying the monitoring plan or putting in certain things in place, let's say, for example, for your training plan or data plan, right? Two kind of things to consider when it comes to here. Sometimes what we end up finding is if we're not talking to one another, the monitoring team may sit there and say, well, it's okay, the data management team's got this, right? They're covering this risk, we don't have to worry about it, right? So, and then the data management team sits there and says, well, no, the monitoring team's got this, we don't have to cover it. So what ends up happening is you have this risk that's not being addressed by either team. And that can potentially lead to an issue, right? Which I think if we work in silos can happen. The converse of that is in a context of having limited resources, the issue is that we both see this risk and both the data management team and the monitor team both see the risk and say, well, you know what, we're both going to be addressing it. And so now they're both looking at that risk and they're not necessarily, and it doesn't require that level, of resource allocation, right? So it's important that we all talk and figure out how we appropriately address these items and how we effectively put systems in place so that those risks have the appropriate and proportionate amount of resources allocated to each of those areas to effectively manage whatever that identified risk was. An area that we kind of look at and I find is really helpful. This comes from a lot from our process improvement colleagues. So if you ever take a Lean Six Sigma class or anything like that, you're going to see this thrown around a lot. The Pareto Principle, the 80-20 rule. Really good book if you want to read it. It's not my book, but I've read it and I found it really, really interesting. The 80-20 principle, which kind of talks about the different systems and how you might be able to incorporate this. And so this is something that we end up finding quite a bit. It's a fairly common principle that we found. And so while most of us kind of think this here, and I know I'm guilty of this one here as well, if I want better results and a better outcome, I need to put in more effort, right? I think studying, this was a very common, if I just slept on my textbooks and spent more time in the library, my grades would go up because I've put in more effort, but that really wasn't the case, sadly. So we thought this was a linear, but it's actually not. Most of the time what we end up finding is that a certain amount of effort, if we apply it appropriately, can get us a fairly significant amount of results, right? So 20% of our efforts can likely get us to 80% of results on a particular domain. So I think it's important that we don't sit there and say that, oh, I only have to put in 20% of my work and I can get 80%, What it's saying is if you only have 100% effort that you can do, you should be able to judiciously pick the amount so that you're not, you're able to more effectively figure out which your highest risk items are and then put your resources that you have that are limited to effectively get those mitigations at an appropriate level, right? So we can pick our each domain more appropriately and then get them to that level where we're able to effectively get them. So we get more bang for our buck, so to speak, if we're able to pick the most important ones and then ultimately provide the appropriate resources to them. And so more globally, this is kind of a fitness for purpose assessment, right? That we figure out what our item is and then we then come up with something that's appropriate and fit for the purpose that we intended. Something that kind of summarizes quality in a nutshell, and I think for us, it's something that we aren't necessarily all that great at disseminating to our stakeholders and kind of understanding what our thought process is. So I can just take a second and kind of deconstruct this diagram because I think it's really important when we start looking at this. Again, this kind of comes from like a process improvement manufacturing sector, but something that I think is important. So if we look at quality costs here, right? And we'll look at quality level here. Here being poor quality, here being exceptional quality. This line here discusses our failure costs. So internal, external, so let's say a protocol not being executed properly, a protocol being executed but not meeting its primary outcomes, being ended for whatever reason because of poor quality, right? So if you see, if we have poor quality over here and we haven't put much effort into it, you'll notice that the costs of that are really high, right? Us not being able to achieve the outcomes of the protocol ends up being a really high cost because we put a lot of effort into that startup, and to not have it come to fruition ends up being a really costly endeavor. On this side here is we have our prevention costs, or our QA costs, so to speak. So let's say, let's say as a really basic proxy and marker, what we say is the amount of staff we have hired. So the more QA staff we have, the greater our quality would be. So the more people I hire, the greater my costs get around QA staff, right? So that seems to be fair, but as my QA staff becomes more and more, you notice that my likelihood of let's say, some quality costs coming into play and us not achieving our outcome, let's say for a protocol, is being minimized. Most people think we live over here, that as QA professionals, we want everything, we want all the resources. Give us everything. We want 100 people in our department, right? But what we're saying is, you guys are living down here. What we want to do is get you a little bit closer here. So if you look at this curve over here, what it is a superposition of both of these different curves. And so what you realize is this dip here is the sweet spot. That's the optimal amount of quality we want to be providing to a particular issue that minimizes the cost of failure without necessarily being overly extraneous with regards to how much we need to put in from the perspective of quality, right? So that's really the area that as quality we're trying to hit. And I try and bring this up a lot when I'm talking to investigators, is like, I'm not trying to get you guys to sit there and think only quality. We realize quantity is important too, right? But what you can do is we can drive ourselves to get to that sweet spot, right? And that's where I'm kind of getting at. And this is when we look at quality management, it's all speaking to that same issue, providing a bit more quality, to get to that level, right? So when we start looking at different items, there's obviously system level versus project level assessments that we have to be aware of, right? So these things here might be like institutional standard operating procedures, institutional guidelines, your institutional training and education program. You have the pleasure of having someone in the audience who spent a lot of time in kind of getting our system robust at where I used to work at. So this is kind of making sure that we have initial training, making sure that ongoing training occurs, and the periodic assessment, making sure it's well. Having your audit program looking at that, that's important. You also have your protocol and your project level parameters, obviously making sure your protocol is well written, it's scientifically valid, concise, there's appropriate safety parameters in place. Your source documents are robust, your CRFs are robust, they all match, they all work well together. That's a great, that's kind of when we're looking at it from a different level. Now, switching gears a little bit and talking about kind of a little foray into the research ethics world. So obviously when this presentation when I was requested to give a talk, I just entered into the research ethics world, and I thought, wow, it's a great way of bringing it together. So this is the talk that I brought up, and I will be completely honest with you in that I failed spectacularly at this, trying to get this thing here done. But I'll tell you where things went okay and where things didn't, and hopefully you guys can learn from that a little bit. So there was a change in the landscape that we found at the institution that we were working at previously. And so the research ethics portfolio previously used to live very distinct from quality assurance. Wasn't necessarily embedded in with the research ethics, so the research ethics office was very distinct, wasn't part of research operations, worked very independently. So the change was that the quality assurance and research ethics portfolio would enter into what wasn't called this way, but functionally became a human participant protection program, so that both of them worked together in ultimately ensuring that the risks that were present to participants were effectively managed. This allowed for kind of a change in some processes to happen and allowed for a lot more information to be available to the quality assurance team and allow for quality assurance and research ethics to work more effectively in achieving those outcomes. Historically, the QA office worked mostly on addressing what was perceived as the highest risk to the institution, which ended up being those regulated research trials, but it allowed us to kind of expand out our horizons a little bit. So we had robust institutional SOPs and tools and templates, and we felt that that was, effective. People were able to utilize them. We had an audit program where we're reviewing things and making sure people were using them effectively. But the next step we felt was just, getting at that beginning process, right? I'm sure most people realize that working in at least most places, if you get REB approval or IRB approval, that's like the final frontier. You've gotten what you need, you're now good to go. If somebody else comes in and says, hold up, we want you to look at this and this and this, it becomes a lot more difficult. So, you know, the initial intent was, well, if we can load that up front and make sure that it's sufficient, then you know what, maybe we're able to get a better control over it. So the intent was to conduct a proactive risk assessment for all new submissions, right? And obviously not just focusing on the ethics and the scientific validity part, but also incorporating a quality review as well. So obviously that would be making sure we did that and looked at that from the lens of both, you know, protocol, ICFs, and making sure even from a regulatory perspective that studies weren't going through the REB and getting approval without their necessarily being aware of those additional regulatory requirements that need to be done. So the Canadian regulatory requirements are that we require approvals in a lot more circumstances than you might see in the US. And so that's something that I think was important for us to kind of get ahead of. That being said, it was an incredibly daunting task. I think early on when I walked into it, I thought, oh, this will definitely be possible. Walked into it not necessarily realizing how much resourcing would be needed. At the time, there wasn't as much resourcing as we would have wanted. So a lot of it was really just dealing with the workload that we had. And so this project ended up not necessarily being able to provide. So obviously that impact was being put in. But again, the only thing based on resources we were able to focus on was on those really, really high risk scenarios that when they were under review through the ethics board that we could flag and address from a quality perspective. So, you know, speaking of that, we really were able to only focus on those highest level risks. There was also some organizational projects that took precedence that required and monopolized a lot of our time. That being said, if that system and when that system goes into fruition and it works as intended, it will actually more effectively help whoever is in that role effectively manage those things, because what was a paper-based system will now go electronic, which now allows someone to review that information a lot more effectively, potentially run reports and aggregates, rather than looking at things manually and having a huge file that they have to carry around and review, right? So it helps people just kind of get a glimpse in a little bit faster. The one thing that ended up being a consequence, which we thought would be the case, but not necessarily as much, was that the timelines were impacted. And so this additional review obviously impacted timelines, and that didn't necessarily bode well. A lot of people were not necessarily super comfortable around there being changes to the timelines and impacts on that. Obviously, this had impact to funders. And so for them, the risks that they perceived is, well, if I don't get my funding, that's a huge risk to me, right? And this is, you know, I haven't necessarily given as much time as wanted. But that being said, that's kind of a risk that wasn't really thought, like I had not necessarily fully thought through when this process went through. Obviously, the cultural perceptions were also something to be aware of, right? A lot of the stakeholders didn't necessarily appreciate the need and weren't necessarily fully aware of what needed to happen, right? I think a lot of times what ended up happening is we lived in our area, we had information that we saw on a day-to-day basis, but that wasn't necessarily always disseminated. So we knew what we were working with and we came up with a procedure that we felt would be effective, but that wasn't necessarily perceived that way by our stakeholders. So our stakeholders didn't see the same level of immediacy because they didn't necessarily perceive that issue. And that was kind of on our end, we didn't necessarily effectively bring that forward. And obviously, anything when you start doing a system level change like this requires backup and requires that it's being supported by senior leadership. And that's definitely something to kind of keep in mind. The one thing I learned from this whole thing, fast, good, cheap, you get to pick 2 of the 3. Right? And that's something that I use far too often now. I wanted good. They had limited resources, so they got cheap. Things weren't fast, right? So this is where things kind of shook out. That being said, sometimes you need to be dynamic. As you can all tell, this magical unicorn zone here, this doesn't exist. You can't have fast, good, and cheap. It just doesn't happen. Something has got to give, right? Because if you want to do things quicker, you generally need more resources, and that's generally not going to be cheap anymore, right? So this is just kind of something that I learned and something I think we all need to keep in mind when speaking to certain people that, you know, well, this is all we can get done, right? Some solutions to keep in mind, I think moving forward in some areas that I realize is if you're going to be looking at incorporating a process like this, or there's something that you find important is, one, if your systems are optimized and you feel you're well staffed and everything seems to be okay, and you've got a little bit of time on the side of your desk to sit there and think about another project and you want to look at that, by all means, that's great. If you think that this is a significant strategic priority for you, having resources allocated to hire staff, I think, is also another option you want to look at. But making sure that you have enough time on your hands is definitely something to be looking at. Changing people's perceptions is important. So when you're going through a change management, making sure that they're aware of the timelines and how they're going to be impacted, and letting people know well ahead of the curve how that might influence them. Right? That might be that you ask for information to be submitted earlier, or if your turnaround time is published as being 1 month, well, maybe it becomes 2 or 2.5, right? But looking at what those risks are of increasing timelines is also an important consideration. That's something I think we need to look at. Obviously, having a process champion or leader to oversee the global direction is obviously really important. Someone who's going to advocate outside of, let's say, just you, who's going to bring this forward to senior leadership. But also really important consideration is thinking about, from a grassroots perspective, is if you can get your staff on board to really, people who are doing this day in, day out, is also an important consideration, something you can definitely bring up and help them bring that forward. Transparency, I can't focus on this enough. I think something at least I know I wasn't as great with, only because it was all these other competing priorities. Being transparent of what I thought we were going to be doing, how we were going to do it, and what impact that was. If I had a chance to do this all over again, I would start with that first, really letting people know this is what we're planning on doing. What are some of the concerns that you would have? Do you feel that this isn't? And then really trying to get their buy-in and get them to be more involved in that process, rather than kind of, oh, well, this is a system that we're going to try and implement. But what we ended up really doing was a pilot, learning from our mistakes, and then ultimately being able to come back to the table and come up with a better approach. All right. The culture obviously is an important point, making sure that all your people who are involved are appropriately at the table. So it's one of those things where it can't just be one person. We had in the buy-in from a director and the chair, but then obviously there's a lot of other people who get involved, and some of our key, some of your key opinion leaders might not necessarily be understanding, so they may go to other people. So making sure that everybody who could potentially have interfaces with this consequence of whatever this action might be is somebody who should be informed and knows about the process and ultimately has agreed to that being brought on board, right? Obviously, building trust and highlight the benefits that exist for stakeholders in the long term is a really important point. I think obviously you want to be incorporating their feedback and bringing it in to your decision making, but I think it's incredibly important to be steadfast and realize that if you really feel that this is what's most important for the organization and where you need to go, that you take their considerations, but ultimately you stay on course and make sure that you achieve what you want. That being said, just a few resources. The one thing we didn't talk on, which I think was really important and helpful, is the EMA reflection paper on risk-based quality management in clinical trials. So that comes from the European Medicine Agency, a decent document that kind of highlights what we talked about here, but also gives a lot of real-world examples and stuff that you can use that are tangible examples if you're talking to people about how you might be able to incorporate this stuff. That being said, I realize I think I'm out of time, so we won't have time for questions, but if you have any, I'll be outside and you can ask me out there. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.